So today we're going to talk about how to identify a function. And we're going to do this by looking at a list of coordinates, a table of values, a graph, and a mapping diagram. So what is a function? Well, a function is a mathematical relationship where each x value corresponds to only one y value. Or just remember, every x value can only have one corresponding y value. Let's talk about the x and y value. The x is also known as the input or the domain, and you can use them interchangeably. And the y is also referred to the output or the range. It's just something you're going to have to remember or memorize. So whenever you hear the word input, think of x. If you think of output, think of y. Now, when we try to identify a function, always remember every input or x value has exactly one corresponding output or y value. Or just remember the x values do not repeat. I repeat, the x values do not repeat. Let's look at an example dealing with a list of coordinates. Looking at example A, I notice there's a list of coordinates and each one has a different x value. Now, since the x values do not repeat, this is a function. However, if you look at example B, I notice that I have an x value of -2, and at the end, I also have another x value of -2, only the y values are different. Now, remember, you can only have one y value for every x value. So if you see two coordinates with the same x value but different y value, not a function. And the same thing is going to go with the table of values. Look at the x values. I notice that each one does not repeat. If it does not repeat, it is a function. However, if you come across a table of values where you do have x values that repeat with different y values, it is not a function. Next, we're going to look at a graph. When we're dealing with a graph and we're trying to find out if it's a function or not, you're going to put it through something called the vertical line test. And the vertical line test is when you draw vertical lines from one side of the graph to the other, and if the line goes through more than one point, it is not a function. For example, if I'm looking at this graph over here in the top left, I'm going to put it through the vertical line test. That's just where I draw straight lines from top to bottom through the graph, and I notice that my vertical line passes through this graph not just once, twice, 3, 4 times. That means it is not a function. However, if I do a vertical line test and I only go through, or each line of the vertical line test only goes through one point of the graph, you have yourself a function. Okay, so looking at the top right graph, I start my vertical line test and it looks good until I get to this point right here where it goes through 1, 2, 3 points. Therefore, not a function. The same thing goes for the circle. It's pretty obvious that the vertical line test is going to fail because it's going to go through more than one point. So this is also not a function. Next, we're going to look at mapping diagrams. Mapping diagrams are just like table of values, where you have the x lined up on one side, all the values of the x lined up on one side, and all the values of the y lined up on the other. And instead of listing the coordinates, what they do is they draw lines from the x value to the y values, showing the coordinate that way. So that coordinate was really -2 for the x value and 13 for the y value. And what I noticed with this mapping diagram is that the x values do not repeat. Therefore, this is a function. However, if you look at example B, you can clearly notice that the 2 is being pointed to the 40 and the 20. So that means there'd be a coordinate of 220 and 240. Therefore, you cannot have this in a function because the x values repeat with different y values. Therefore, this is not a function. You need to remember one exception to the rule, and that is if the x values repeat but they share the same y value, then it is still considered a function. For example, I noticed that I have a coordinate of 4, 6 and another coordinate of 4, 6. It still sticks to the rule where you have one x value affiliated with one y value. Therefore, this is still considered a function. And the same thing goes in a table of values. If you have two x values that are the same, but they also have the same y values, it's still considered a function. Now it's time to see how you do. Pause the video here and identify if the following are functions or non-functions. And then once you're ready, unpause the video and reveal the answers. So hopefully you got them all right. If you did, put on some music and throw yourself a dance party. And remember, the only time success comes before work is in the dictionary. This has been a Struggling Student Productions. If you like this video, if it was helpful, please press like at the bottom and subscribe to our channel. Thank you.